Going the extra mile, the role of mandated reporters in a trauma-informed child welfare system. What is psychological trauma? Psychological trauma is a condition that results from a person or family's exposure to an overwhelmingly stressful situation that leads to feelings of helplessness or hopelessness. And the exposure to psychological trauma changes how a person or family functions. Children and adults from families that use child welfare services often have had multiple and extremely toxic exposure to traumatic situations throughout their lifetime. Nationally, almost 1/3 of children that are in substantiated reports of abuse and neglect will be in another substantiated report within the next 5 years. Okay, so most people have experienced some sort of psychological trauma in their lifetime. So why is exposure to multiple traumatic experiences such a big deal? Well, a lot of what we know about multiple traumatic experiences, the exposure to multiple traumatic experiences, came from the Centers for Disease Control Adverse Childhood Experience Study. We call that the ACEs study. And if you're not familiar with the ACEs study, I don't have a link here, but if you just Google ACEs study, you'll find a lot of information about it. The ACEs study was a large-scale longitudinal study that looked at the impact of multiple traumatic experiences in childhood on people throughout their lifetime. And what the ACEs study found is that multiple traumatic experiences in childhood predisposes people to a long list of behavioral, psychological, medical, and social problems as adults. So when these kids that we're talking about that are in multiple substantiated reports of abuse or neglect, when these children become adults and they have their own kids, their childhood trauma and the resulting problems becomes part of the context in which the next generation of children grows up. So we call this phenomenon together the experience of multiple or ongoing trauma and the resulting problems that it causes. We call this complex trauma. And what we know is that complex trauma can be chronic, it's intergenerational, and I believe that it's the defining characteristic of the child welfare population. The rest of this presentation will focus on the 6 principles that can be used to build and evaluate trauma-informed systems, and we'll talk specifically about how you can apply the principles of trauma-informed care to your role as a mandated reporter. The principles of trauma-informed care are safety, referring to emotional and physical safety, trustworthiness, sometimes called transparency, collaboration, empowerment, and choice. All of this based on the work of Fallett and Harris, and there's a link to some of their research at the end of this presentation. Just a reminder about the role of mandated reporters in New York State's child welfare system. Mandated reporters are members of identified professions who, based on their own expertise, training, and experience, are required to report reasonable suspicions of child abuse and maltreatment to the New York State Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment, which I will refer to as the SCR. So I just want to stop for a second and talk about something that I mentioned earlier, and that's the concern that child welfare and child protection systems in particular can actually create trauma for families. That's something that you may not have thought about before. The research shows that child protection systems are widely viewed by service users as a threat to their children, and that's because of the possibility that the system can take children away from their parents. So for those of you who are parents, I just want you to take a moment to stop and think about how you would feel if a CPS worker showed up at your door with a letter that says there's an allegation you abused or maltreated your child. Would you feel threatened? Would you think that your children were being threatened? Now, anytime parents believe that their children are threatened, they're going to react with an overwhelming emotional response. That sounds a lot like the definition of psychological trauma that we talked about earlier, a threat with an overwhelming emotional response. We also know from the same research by Buckley, Carr, and Whelan that for families that have historically been involved in child welfare, or for families that have had children removed from their homes, even when there is no active and open CPS case, families still tend to believe that CPS is a constant threat. So the fear of the child welfare system becomes a chronic stressor to families that actually decreases parent and family functioning. Now, that doesn't sound like a particularly helpful system dynamic, does it? How can you, in your role as a mandated reporter, decrease trauma for families involved in the child welfare system? Let's talk about applying the principles of trauma-informed care. Safety refers to all of your agency's efforts to protect the physical and emotional safety of consumers at your agency. In the first 24 hours after a hotline report is made, CPS has to gather enough information to complete an initial safety assessment for all of the children in the home. When you're the source of a report, you can help CPS collect this information by leaving an alternative contact phone number, either your personal cell phone or your home phone number. This is especially important when you make a report to the SCR late at the end of your workday. The way a CPS worker begins the safety assessment is by contacting the source of the report to check their understanding of the concerns in the report and gather additional information necessary for that initial safety assessment. If the CPS worker is unable to contact you, either because you didn't leave a phone number or you left your work phone number and then you went home at the end of the day, the CPS worker can't gather the information from you that they need to complete that initial safety assessment, and they're forced to collect the information in different ways. Sometimes this means an unannounced home visit late in the evening, or even sending the police to the home in the middle of the night to see the children and talk to the parents. These are more traumatic ways to complete that initial safety assessment, so it's important that you leave an alternate phone number. Mandated reporters should not use the threat of an SCR report to scare parents into complying with agency recommendations or services. If you see evidence of maltreatment or abuse, you're compelled to make a report. If you don't see evidence, don't threaten parents. CPS is an agency that helps parents get the resources they need to take care of their children. We need the help of mandated reporters to promote a less threatening image of child protective services. Trustworthiness refers to the degree with which mandated reporters are clear and consistent about their mandated reporting requirements. This means you have to tell families and remind them often about your responsibilities as a mandated reporter. You should talk to the children on your caseload about the limits of confidentiality in language they can understand. Some mandated reporters are concerned that if they remind people about their mandated reporting requirements, people will be less inclined to share information about abuse or neglect in their home. This is true, and you need to tell them about the confidentiality and mandated reporting requirements anyway. Families are less likely to be honest with service providers about problems when they know about mandated reporting requirements. Research has shown that mandated reporting sometimes deters people from accepting services. As long as we have a system that requires mandated reporting, this is going to be an unfortunate reality. We still need to be honest with people about mandated reporting requirements and the limits of confidentiality. Social services law prevents CPS from revealing the source of a report to the State Central Register of Abuse and Maltreatment. This is an area where child welfare really lacks transparency. As a mandated reporter, you have the choice about whether or not to tell a family when and why a report is being made. Telling a family that you need to make a report will reduce the shock and fear when the family is first contacted by CPS. Some service providers express concern that if they tell families that they're the source of a report, the family may withdraw from services. While that's true, my experience has been that if a mandated reporter is clear with families about the limits of confidentiality and takes time to explain to them the reasons a report is being made, the families rarely withdraw from services. Another concern raised by mandated reporters is that if they tell the family that a report was made, it may damage the relationship with the service provider. Again, if the service provider is clear with a family about the limits of confidentiality and tells them the reasons for the report, it seems to do less damage to the relationship. Mandated reporters should be aware that when they withhold information from the family, when they fail to tell the family that they're the source of the report, it often does damage some relationship for the family. Families might blame it on a relative or on a neighbor and cut off that relationship. And then, because the mandated reporter failed to be transparent, a helpful relationship was damaged, and the family has even less natural supports. Finally, mandated reporters are often worried about messing up a CPS investigation. They're concerned that if they tell the family that they're making a report, it might interfere in the evidence gathering process. This is a valid concern, especially in cases of child sex abuse and physical abuse. If you're concerned that revealing the source of the report might mess up an investigation, don't do it. Wait until the CPS worker contacts you as the source of the report to review the report narrative. At that time, you can ask the CPS worker if it's okay for you to contact the family and let them know that you made a report and why you made the report. Then you can call the family, let them know that you made a report, explain the reasons why, and tell them that a CPS worker will be contacting them. Empowerment refers to the degree with which you prioritize client skill building in your practice. As a mandated reporter, it's important to help your clients learn and practice appropriate communication skills that will allow them to interact effectively with Child Protective Services and other helping systems. When you're working with a client who shares information about themselves or another family, and that information needs to be reported to the SCR, get the phone number and sit with your client and help them make the report themselves. This is good practice interacting with a threatening system, and it's also going to leave your client better prepared if they should encounter children in the future who appear to be victims of abuse or neglect. When you're working with clients who have difficult or fearful relationships with any helping system, CPS, probation, or even the school district, make sure you're using all of your interactions as an opportunity to teach appropriate and effective communication skills. You want to leave your clients with the words and skills they need to effectively advocate for themselves. These skills reduce those traumatic feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. Choice refers to the efforts made by your agency to maximize the experience of consumer control. As a mandated reporter, you may encounter a situation where it seems like the easiest way to link a family with important services is to make an SCR report. For example, if a family presents at your agency as homeless, you may not know all of the resources available to help the family. It could be tempting to make an SCR report to let CPS find the family housing. I challenge you not to do that. Don't make a report just to link a family with services. Get on the phone, get on the internet, find out what is available to help, and present the family with all of their options. Then you and your client can work together to make choices that are best for the family. Maximizing client control means educating clients about their rights, even when it makes your job more difficult. Is your client angry about a recent SCR report and demanding more information about what happened? Make sure your client knows how to request a copy of their own file. Does your client want to limit your ability to communicate with other service providers? Show your client how to revoke the releases they've signed. It can be tempting to withhold information about agency process from clients who will use the information in a way that makes our jobs more difficult. But don't do it. Your job should be difficult. It's important work that you do. And we need systems that can help people without reinforcing and strengthening traditional power structures between service providers and service recipients. Have a client who's making your job more difficult? Be thankful. They're making you a better service provider. Collaboration refers to the degree to which your agency maximizes the client's experience of sharing power with the service providers. This means you can't use your mandated reporting requirements to boost your power in the relationship. Don't threaten clients with SCR reports, and certainly don't tell them that if they fail to comply with your requirements, CPS will take their children away. Sometimes mandated reporters do have bottom lines. An example would be if you become aware that there's domestic violence in the home of your client and that her small children are being exposed to it. Have a conversation with your client and let her know the bottom line is she needs to figure out a way to protect the children. Present her the options. She could get an order of protection. She could go to a domestic violence shelter. She could file a police report. Your client's going to have other ideas too. She might suggest going to stay with family or sending the children to the grandparents' house. Any of these plans meet your bottom line requirement, so let your client decide. This is closely related to letting your client use their own resources. You may want your client to apply for food stamps. She may prefer to use the food pantry at her church. As long as it meets your bottom line, go with her plan. Finally, your good work building collaborative safety plans with your client doesn't relieve you of your mandated reporter responsibilities. Remember, if you have reasonable cause to suspect that a child has been abused or maltreated, you must make a report to the State Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment, even if your client has an adequate safety plan in place. So your work's not done. Now you can advocate with CPS to help the worker understand your client's strengths and resources and how your client's plan builds on those strengths and resources. I did want to remind you, if you're unsure of your role or responsibilities as a mandated reporter, please visit www.nysmandatedreporter.org, and the New York State Mandated Reporter Hotline is 1-800-635-1522. Here's a list of resources where you can find more information about the topics that we've presented on today. And finally, I just want to stop and take a second to say thank you to each one of you for the important work that you do on behalf of vulnerable children and vulnerable families every day. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedules today to listen to me talk about trauma-informed care and a trauma-informed child welfare system. Do you have any questions?